If I had not stayed in my seat and finished my fries, I would not be telling this story right now. I was 14 years old on that Halloween night sitting inside a McDonald's that my friends treated like a legend. That specific location had a rumor attached to it, and even though adults rolled their eyes, kids at school swore the burgers tasted wrong. The story was simple and disgusting at the same time. People said the meat was mixed with human flesh. Nobody had proof, but everyone had a cousin or a neighbor who knew someone who had noticed something strange. It became a dare between us, a creepy challenge to see who could eat there without flinching. My parents thought it was nonsense. They were focused on finding a table while my little sister complained about her costume. The restaurant was full of families, fake cobwebs, and plastic pumpkins taped to the walls. It looked harmless, loud, and normal. I kept staring at the hallway that led to the kitchen, and the more I looked at it, the more I felt pulled toward it. I wanted to see the grill with my own eyes and prove that the rumor was just a stupid story. When my parents started arguing about where to sit, I slid out of the booth and walked toward the employees-only door. I moved slowly so no one would notice, telling myself I would just peek and come back in less than a minute. My heart was beating fast, but I convinced myself it was just excitement. An employee pushed through the door carrying a tray, and before it shut completely, I slipped inside. The kitchen was bright and loud, filled with the sound of oil popping and orders being called out. Everything looked exactly like a normal fast food kitchen. For a few seconds, I almost felt embarrassed for believing the rumor. Workers were flipping patties, salting fries, and stacking buns in quick, practiced motions. There were no secret rooms and no obvious signs of anything illegal. Still, I stepped further in and stood behind a stack of boxes so I could observe without being seen. I wanted to be sure before I walked back out. At first, nothing seemed strange, and I started thinking I should leave before I got caught. Then my eyes landed on a metal prep table near the back wall, and I leaned slightly to get a clearer look. The lights were bright, and there was no confusion about what was in front of me. There was a human hand resting on the table. It was clean and pale, cut at the wrist, placed next to a tray like it belonged there. My brain tried to tell me it was fake, but it did not look like a cheap Halloween prop. It looked real. When I stepped back, I knocked over a trash can, and the crash echoed through the kitchen. Several employees turned their heads at the same time. One of them walked straight toward me without rushing, which made it worse because he looked calm. "What are you doing here?" I tried to answer, but I kept staring at the table. He followed my gaze and then looked back at me with a different expression. Another employee came up behind me and pressed his hand over my mouth, while the first one grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "You were not supposed to see that." They dragged me across the floor while I struggled, and I could feel my shoes sliding on the tile as I tried to pull free. Nobody from the dining area came in, and the noise of the machines covered everything. They moved me to a metal prep table in the corner and forced me on top of it while one of them cleared space. I fought back as much as I could, but they worked together and held me down with steady pressure. One tied my wrists with rough cord, while another secured my ankles to the table legs. I tried to shout when they removed the hand from my mouth, but one of them leaned close and spoke over me. "You wanted to know what's in the meat, right?" The way he said it was not playful. It sounded controlled and deliberate. The other two watched my face closely, like they were waiting for my reaction. One of them lifted my arm and examined it slowly, running his fingers along my skin. Another grabbed a container of salt and sprinkled it across my forearm, spreading it with his palm while smiling in a way that made my chest tighten. "Fresh." They talked about me like I was an item on the menu. I kept pulling against the ropes, but they held tight and cut into my skin. I looked toward the door, hoping someone would walk in, but the kitchen kept running like nothing was wrong. One of them stepped away and grabbed a large kitchen knife from near the grill. He held it up so I could see the full blade, and the overhead lights reflected off the metal. The other two leaned closer to the table while the fryer continued bubbling behind me. He pressed the flat side of the knife against my arm first, and the cold metal made me tense. When he turned the blade so the sharp edge touched my skin, I felt a thin line of pressure that made it hard to breathe steadily. I pulled hard against the ropes, but they held me in place. You were curious, so now you get a closer look. Another employee leaned near my face. We will name the combo after you. The blade started moving slowly across my arm in a cutting motion, and I braced for pain. My body strained against the restraints, and I could feel my shoulders arching from the effort. Just as the pressure increased, he stopped the blade before it broke the skin. All three of them began laughing, and the sound felt loud and wrong in that small space. The one holding the knife stepped back. Happy Halloween! They picked up the hand from the table and bent the fingers to show it was rubber. They opened a drawer filled with fake body parts and explained that they were tired of rumors and had decided to scare anyone who tried to sneak into the kitchen. They untied me and warned me not to tell anyone, saying that the next time it would not be so harmless. I walked back to my family's table and sat down without saying a word. I told my parents I felt sick and we left early. For weeks after that, I avoided the place and tried to convince myself it had only been a twisted prank. I stopped eating burgers and ignored my friends when they joked about the rumor. Part of me wanted to believe it was all fake. One evening, my dad called me into the living room and pointed at the television. The news showed that Sam McDonald's surrounded by police cars and yellow tape. The reporter explained that the restaurant had been shut down after investigators discovered human remains stored inside the kitchen. 3 employees had been arrested. When their faces appeared on the screen, I recognized them immediately. The report said small amounts of human tissue had been mixed with regular meat for months. The so-called Halloween props had included real body parts that were altered and stored. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that the knife against my arm had not been part of a harmless joke. They had laughed while holding a real blade and real body parts in that kitchen. The only reason I was not part of that investigation was because they decided to let me walk out. My parents never learned what really happened behind that door. They still think I just wandered somewhere I should not have been and got scared by decorations. I never corrected them because I do not know how to explain how close I came to becoming something else. The building is now empty and the sign is gone, but I still remember the metal table and the way they spoke about me like I was food. I went in to prove a rumor was fake, and instead, I learned that sometimes the worst stories are not exaggerations at all.
I'm not going to pretend I was innocent in how this started. I cheated on my ex-boyfriend because I fell in love with someone else, and I chose that new relationship knowing the consequences. I told him the truth, and I left, and I still remember how his face went blank in a way that felt more dangerous than if he had screamed. After the breakup, he did not beg or cry, and that silence lasted only a day before the messages began. He wrote long paragraphs at first, accusing me of humiliating him and throwing away years together. He started repeating that I would regret it and that I had no idea what it would cost me. I blocked him everywhere, but he kept finding new numbers and fake profiles, and each time I thought it was over, another message appeared. When I filed a harassment report, I believed the situation would calm down, but instead his anger sharpened into something focused and patient. He knew my routines because we had lived together for 2 years, and I had never thought about how predictable I was. He knew what time I left for work and which grocery store I preferred. He also knew that every Friday night I ordered Wendy's and stayed home watching something mindless to end the week. After the police report, his messages became shorter and more direct, and they felt less emotional and more like warnings. He wrote that I had made a mistake by involving authorities, and that I would understand soon. Gustav, my new boyfriend, tried to reassure me, and told me that most threats never turn into real action. That Friday, I ordered my usual meal, even though a part of me hesitated before confirming the purchase. I watched the delivery tracker move closer to my building and tried to convince myself that keeping my routine was a way to refuse fear. I did not know that my ex was already outside, waiting for that delivery driver to arrive. The doorbell rang earlier than expected, and the sound echoed through my apartment in a way that made me pause before moving. When I checked the peephole, no one was there, and when I opened the door, The bag was sitting alone on the floor. I picked it up anyway, because nothing about it looked wrong from the outside. I carried the bag to the kitchen table and told myself that the driver probably left quickly to save time. The food felt warm and normal, and for a brief second I felt embarrassed about how tense I had become. When I opened the box, everything looked correct at first glance, including the chicken and the fries, arranged exactly as usual. There was a small plastic container inside that I had not ordered, sealed tightly as if someone had added it carefully. I stared at it longer than I should have, because something about its presence felt deliberate. When I finally opened it, I saw a human finger resting inside, cut cleanly and stained dark at the base. The nail was painted black, and I recognized the shape immediately, because I had painted Dario's nails 2 nights before as a joke. The container slipped from my hand and hit the floor, and I felt my balance shift as if the room had tilted. I called Dario right away, but his mother answered while crying so hard that her voice broke apart. She told me that someone had attacked him outside his building, and that several of his fingers had been cut off before neighbors found him bleeding on the sidewalk. While she described the scene, my apartment lights went out without warning, and the call ended abruptly. I stood there in darkness, surrounded by the smell of fried food and the sound of my own uneven breathing. A heavy impact struck my front door and made the frame shake against the wall. Another hit followed, stronger and more precise, as if the person outside knew exactly where to apply force. Then I heard his voice from outside, steady but filled with restrained rage. "You thought you could replace me and move on. You thought I would just disappear." I called the police immediately while he kept kicking the door, spacing each blow in a way that made me anticipate the next impact. The top hinge cracked after several hits, and small pieces of wood fell onto the floor near my feet. I grabbed a kitchen knife even though I had never used one for anything but cooking, because standing empty-handed felt worse. My body reacted with fear, but I forced myself to stay upright and aware of his movements. He broke the door open enough to step inside, and I saw that his expression was not wild or chaotic, but focused and intense. He moved toward me slowly and spoke without raising his voice, which made his words feel more deliberate. "You destroyed everything we had. Now you will understand what that feels like." When I tried to move away, he grabbed my wrist and squeezed hard enough to make me lose grip of the knife. He shoved me against the wall and pinned me there, pressing his forearm against my throat while keeping his face close to mine. I could see tension in his jaw and a kind of cold determination that made me realize this was planned. I struggled and pushed back, managing to scratch his face and briefly loosen his hold. He reacted by slamming me into the refrigerator and knocking magnets and glass to the floor. While he held me down, I heard distant sirens approaching, and I saw him glance toward the broken doorway for a second. That sound shifted something in him, and his movements became faster and more urgent. He shoved me onto the floor and stood over me with an expression that mixed anger with satisfaction. "This is only the start. You involved the police, so now we both suffer." He kicked a chair out of his path and ran out of the apartment before officers reached the building. I remained on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken wood and spilled food, trying to process what had just happened. When the police arrived, they documented the damage and the blood from his arm, where I had managed to cut him. At the hospital, I saw Gustav, lying in a bed with his hand wrapped in thick bandages, and the empty space where his fingers had been made the situation feel permanent. He tried to speak calmly, but his voice trembled when he asked who could do something like that. I could not answer without feeling that my choices had led directly to that bed. Days later, I received another message from an unknown number containing a photo of my apartment hallway. The caption read, "I can still reach you." The police increased patrols, but they admitted that until he made another move, their options were limited. A neighbor eventually provided security footage, showing him entering the building the night of the attack, which allowed the police to issue a warrant. They located him in a rented storage unit, where they found the delivery driver, tied up but alive and badly beaten. Inside the unit were knives, gloves, and a cooler. that confirmed the attack had been carefully prepared. When he was arrested, he did not resist or appear surprised. During interrogation, he admitted that he wanted me to feel irreversible loss, just as he felt publicly humiliated and abandoned. His explanation was not emotional, but logical, in a way that made the cruelty even harder to accept. The trial resulted in a prison sentence that removed him from my daily life, but it did not erase what had happened. Gustav and I eventually separated because the trauma created distance that neither of us could bridge. Every glance at his injured hand was a reminder of how everything started. It has been 3 years, but a few months ago I received a message from an unknown number with a photo attached. It showed a Wendy's bag placed outside an apartment door, and that door was mine. The picture had clearly been taken from across the street, and the angle was familiar. The police confirmed that he remains in prison, and then they suggested that someone else might be trying to frighten me. That explanation does not bring comfort. Every time my phone vibrates late at night, I feel that same tightening in my chest. I made a choice that hurt someone deeply, but I don't deserve all this suffering that I can't escape, and no one can help me with.
The night my father walked into the McDonald's where I worked, the distance I had been trying to build between my job and my home life collapsed in a matter of seconds. I had taken that job because I wanted to leave my parents' house and stand on my own. Not because we needed the money. My family was comfortable, but comfort in that house came with control, and every decision about my future was already planned without asking me what I wanted. I did not care about cleaning bathrooms or smelling like grease after a double shift, because every paycheck meant I was closer to renting a small place of my own. My father, however, saw the uniform as an insult to our last name. He said I was lowering myself, embarrassing the family, and throwing away opportunities that he had worked hard to build. The arguments became routine, and they always ended with him reminding me that he paid for everything and that I owed him obedience. One morning he locked the front door and hid my phone so I would miss my shift, but I climbed out the kitchen window and took the bus across town anyway. My manager noticed the tension in me, but let me keep working, and that job slowly became the only space where I felt like I had a choice. The more hours I worked, the more my father escalated his pressure at home. He would wait for me in silence and then start long speeches about reputation and respect, and although he did not always shout, the threat under his words was clear. He began calling the restaurant during my shifts, demanding that I come home immediately and warning me that he would show up if I did not. My coworkers started noticing the pattern, even though I tried to act normal while taking orders and filling trays. Mateo, who worked the grill, began walking me to the bus stop after closing because he sensed something was wrong. I told him my father was strict and stubborn, but I did not explain how intense the control had become behind closed doors. The night everything broke apart started during a crowded dinner rush, when the restaurant was loud with families and blinking screens. I was behind the counter, organizing a large order, when the front doors slammed open so hard that several customers turned at once. I did not need to look up to know who had just walked in. My father moved through the restaurant with a rigid posture and a stare that made people step aside without being told. My manager approached him carefully and asked him to step outside if he needed to talk, but my father ignored the request and demanded that I come forward immediately. I walked around the counter because I did not want him climbing over it, and I tried to keep my voice steady while telling him I was working. He leaned close and told me I was done humiliating the family, and when my manager insisted that he leave or the police would be called, something in my father snapped. He grabbed a stack of trays and threw them across the floor, causing plastic to scatter and customers to rush toward the exit. The sudden violence shifted the entire room from confusion to fear. He grabbed my hair with force and dragged me out from behind the counter into the open area near the tables. I I hit the floor hard, and before I could push myself up, he kicked me in the side while people screamed and pulled out their phones. He shouted that I had disgraced him and that he would not allow his daughter to work in a place like this. My manager stepped forward despite obvious fear, and Mateo moved away from the grill, watching closely for a chance to intervene. I tried to pull my father's hand away from my hair, but his grip was tight and controlled, and he forced me to my feet again. The situation shifted into something far more dangerous when my father reached into his coat pocket, and the movement drew immediate attention from everyone nearby. My manager froze mid-step, and Mateo stopped advancing, clearly unsure of what was coming next. When the handgun appeared in my father's hand, the noise inside the restaurant dropped to a stunned silence. He pointed the weapon directly at my manager and ordered everyone to back up, and the fear on their faces was immediate and real. My manager raised his hands and took slow steps backward, while customers pressed themselves against the walls. My father kept one hand twisted in my hair and used the other to aim the gun around the room. He announced that I was leaving with him, and that anyone who tried to interfere would be shot. As he began walking backward toward the exit, he dragged me with him, keeping the gun moving from one person to another to maintain control. I tried to resist by shifting my weight and slowing my steps, but he responded by pulling harder and pressing the weapon forward. Mateo spoke up and told him to let me go, and although fear was visible in his face, he did not retreat. My father answered with anger, insisting that no one had the right to question how he handled his daughter. We were only a few steps from the door when my father adjusted his grip on the gun, and that slight distraction created a narrow opening. Mateo lunged forward and wrapped his arms around my father from behind, locking his arms against his sides in an attempt to control the weapon. The struggle began instantly, with both of them slipping on the greasy floor while trying to overpower each other. I dropped to the ground and crawled several feet away because I knew I could not stand between them. My father slammed his head backward into Mateo's face, and the impact made a sharp sound that caused more panic among the customers who had not yet escaped. Mateo staggered but tightened his grip, attempting to force the gun downward toward the floor. The first shot fired into the ceiling, sending debris down and causing several people to scream. The second shot was aimed straight at Mateo's chest, and the sound felt louder than the first. Mateo's body jerked, and he took 2 unstable steps backward before collapsing near the soda machine. Blood spread across the tile quickly, and the sight of it triggered another wave of panic as customers rushed outside. I tried to move toward him, but my manager grabbed me and pulled me away because my father was still armed and turning in place. Sirens approached from outside, and 2 customers tackled my father while he was distracted, knocking him to the floor and forcing the gun from his hand. Police officers entered seconds later and restrained him as he continued shouting that he had done nothing wrong. Paramedics rushed in and began working on Mateo, while officers secured the scene and moved everyone else outside. They cut open his uniform shirt and pressed gauze against the wound, while speaking urgently about blood loss. I stood near the entrance, held back by an officer, watching them try to save someone who had stepped forward to protect me. Mateo was placed on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance, and I followed until I was stopped at the sidewalk. My father was being forced into a patrol car, still yelling that he had acted to defend his family's honor. Later that night, at the police station, I learned that Mateo had died at the hospital. I gave a detailed statement about the assault, the gun, and the struggle because I needed the record to be accurate. My father was charged with multiple crimes, including murder, and his name appeared on the news within hours. I moved into a small apartment not long after, using the money I'd saved from working long shifts. I still work at the same McDonald's because leaving would feel like abandoning the place where someone risked everything for me.